Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. And I'm your host, Mike Allen. As a kid, did you ever play outside near an old oak tree? One of those really old big ones that probably had a hollowed out area or cavity where squirrels and animals hung out? Well, in Hartford, the so-called charter oak had one of those cavities. In fact, a very large one, as you'll hear. And one of the most important documents in state history, in fact, perhaps the most important document in Connecticut history, was once hidden inside that tree. Or at least the story goes that way. Well, here to tell us about this incredible and important tree is Dave Corrigan. He's the longtime and now retired curator of the Museum of Connecticut History. It's a post he held for 4 decades, and does he ever know a lot? Dave will be along in just a moment with this great tale. This week's trivia question: he showed a very special gold ring to the King of England, and Connecticut got something that many other colonial colonies did not. Who was he? Stick around after the main program for the answer, because then you'll know the topic for next week's show. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is brought to you by our sponsor, Yale New Haven Health. Yale New Haven Hospital was the very first hospital in Connecticut. They opened their doors 200 years ago and later introduced the entire country to the use of penicillin and chemotherapy. Today, some of the brightest minds in medicine choose to work there, and it's the primary teaching hospital for the prestigious Yale School of Medicine. For more information, log on to ynhhs.org. That's ynhhs.org. Well, this is a great story. It's one of Connecticut's oldest yarns, if you will. It's the story of the great charter oak in Hartford, a tree that stood proudly for 250 years before a violent storm back in the 1800s finally took it down. Its role in shaping the early image of Connecticut simply cannot be overstated. In fact, even our license plates speak to us being the Constitution state, and that'll give you a hint as to what was in it. According to legend, this tree helped protect nothing less than Connecticut's remarkable royal charter that had been granted by none other than Charles II, the King of England. Then when a king subsequent to Charles, King James II, wanted to take back the charter, well, the charter was then supposedly squirreled away in the tree itself. How it got there, who put it there, and under what circumstances is this great story that's going to be told in this episode today. Now, the charter was incredible because it gave the then Connecticut colony certain formal rights. Until then, the colony had been operating under something called the Fundamental Orders. Now, this was back in 1639 when the colony existed, and it only consisted of 3 settlements, the settlements of Windsor, Wethersfield, and Hartford. So when the king gave this new colony the more formal royal charter, well, it solidified its existence and made it more or less official. So when later on King James II decided to rescind that charter after 25 years, well, Connecticut wasn't having any of it. And the story of how they pulled this off is simply great. To tell this story, we turn to an expert, the longtime, now retired curator of the Museum of Connecticut History in Hartford, Dave Corrigan. Dave, we're talking about the charter oak, so let's start off talking about the charter oak. What can you tell me about the history of the tree? What kind of tree was it? I mean, from what I understand, the first real notation about it dates all the way back to the early 1600s.
It was a white oak. Seems to be unusually large even for that species of tree. I know the local Native American population, they appreciated it. They considered it as a symbol of fertility with the recurring acorns and the leaves and everything, and it was highly regarded by the Native American population. I don't think it drew much attention by the colonial settlers, until the charter oak incident. In the late 19th century, there were actually some fires in the trunk of the tree. And when they were put out, of course, the tree was kind of decimated inside. But at one point, I read an account of there were about 10 or 12 firemen that could stand inside the trunk after the fire was put out. So it gives you some idea of the size of the circumference of the tree.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, it was interesting. In my own personal case, for a couple of years, my family and I lived in Newtown, and we had this gigantic white oak on our property. And at one point, I put the rope around it as they told us to do and measured it, and it was 23 feet in circumference, which made it the 19th largest white oak in the state of Connecticut. There's no state arborist, but there is a group that keeps track of such things. And the tree had a name. It was called the General. And it came down in a storm about 5 years ago. Anyway, so I have a sense of just how large these things are, and they are gigantic. But this one was even much bigger.
I do know that once the tree fell in 1856, the state provided descendants or the scions of the charter oak. There's one still standing, I believe, in Bushnell Park. It's got a little granite monument at the base. And there were quite a few sent around the state and planted in various locations around the state. It was such a highly regarded tree that, the people wanted these for their town green or their property, whatever, and they could get them. I don't know how many are still standing. Probably a good number of them still are such a sturdy tree.
Let's talk also now about where this was. It was on the estate of a gentleman named George Willis.
He was the governor of Connecticut from 1642 to 1645, and he served under the fundamental orders which preceded the charter. And he built a house, called a mansion in those days. And just past Main Street on Buckingham Street, there's a little side street. It's Charter Oak Place. And there's a monument to the Charter Oak that was built on the corner of that intersection. It was put up in 1905 by the Society of the Colonial Wars in the state of Connecticut. And the house that Willis built appears in several of the depictions of the Charter Oak over the years. And at the time of the incident in 1687, it was owned by his grandson, Samuel Willis. Now, the family was very much involved in Connecticut politics. I think one of the Willises held the position of Secretary of State for about, 40 years or so. And there were a number of families that basically ruled Connecticut from the 1600s up until about 1818 when the new Constitution went in. There were the Willises, the Wolcotts, 8 or 10 families that had a lock on the government because they could be reelected every year, in successive years. They just got elected and they never left office.
When you talk about why they would want to hide the charter in the tree, I think we need to spend just a couple of seconds talking about the fact that the charter was really unique. And let's start off with the land rights. I mean, it extended Connecticut far to the west, correct?
Yes, the boundaries of Connecticut were Narragansett Bay westward to the South Sea, according to the charter. I've seen maps from the 1780s that extend Connecticut right across, it's a narrow strip of land from the Rhode Island area to the Mississippi River. That's as far as they ever drew it on the maps. But they had no idea how far away the South Sea was in the 1660s. But if that had held true, it would be quite a commute from Southern California to Hartford every day and back.
Exactly. Now, there was more to the charter than just the land, right? It gave Connecticut some unique self-governing principles.
It granted the governor and the company of the English colony of Connecticut a wide degree of self-government. It created a corporation, the members of which were the freemen of Connecticut who could vote and elect their rulers. The company could grant lands, sell lands, purchase lands. It provided for a governmental structure. There was a governor, the deputy governor, and 12 assistants. The legislative and judicial power was granted to the General Assembly, but the one reservation was that they could not enact any laws that were contrary to the laws of England. The charter was the document by which Connecticut was governed from 1662 until 1818.
So in terms of the charter and wanting to protect it, let's talk about this incident that happened 25 years after the charter was issued. And not to oversimplify it, but you had King Charles II grant this charter, and now you had King James II, and he didn't necessarily think this was such a good idea, did he? And he wanted to change and have a dominion of New England, and this really was sort of causing a problem for him in terms of implementation. Was that a fair summation of why he took the action to try and seize Connecticut's charter?
Yes, exactly. He wanted to consolidate power over most of the territory from, I think, Delaware right up through Maine, which included Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and their charters. In order to pursue that, he sent Edmund Andros to New England as the governor of the Dominion. One of his charges was to collect the charters from all the charter colonies, effectively removing their freedoms and subjecting them to direct rule by the king. And that's what prompted the Charter Oak incident in 1687.
So now there's a meeting in Hartford, and I understand it was at an inn, and James Wadsworth was there. And I don't want to tell the story. I want you to tell the story. What happened?
Well, we don't really know what happened, but the story has been passed down through the ages that Edmund Andros came to Hartford in late October 1687 to demand the charter, and he had been in contact with Governor Robert Treat in Connecticut, and negotiations had been made, and some of the members of the General Assembly were assembled in this room in the inn in Hartford, and Andros arrived and demanded that the charter be produced. So it was produced and rolled out on the table. And then, according to the story, at one point, all the lights, the candles were blown out. And in the ensuing darkness, James Wadsworth grabbed the charter and took it, ran through the streets of Hartford down to the tree on the property of Governor Willis, of Samuel Willis, and hid it in a large opening at the base of the tree. No one has found any contemporary documentary evidence to support this. It's a wonderful story of, Connecticut preserving its freedoms under the charter, but it can't be documented. In a sense, it doesn't matter. I mean, it's happened 330 some odd years ago. It's still a kind of a defining moment in Connecticut political history. And some people have said, well, it doesn't really matter if it happened or not. It's a great story. And I kind of tend to agree with that. It'd be nice if we would be able to authenticate it, but it's just not possible.
And you're right. There are stories that you can access that tell all sorts of great yarns about what happened or subsequent to that. I mean, I even read one where Wadsworth was facing some sort of legal recrimination afterwards for his activities. But again, I've not seen that confirmed anywhere else. You haven't either, I assume.
No, I haven't, no.
So let's then go fast forward. The tree, which now has this great significance for Connecticut, and it's a foundation of how we view ourselves in freedom, and come along now to the 1800s. The poor tree has had fires, as you said, inside it. It's 250 years old, and there's one of these typical Connecticut August thunderstorms that comes rolling through. And what happened?
The tree was either blown over or possibly struck by lightning. I think it was actually blown over by a gust of wind. The Connecticut people just went crazy. There was a long period of mourning over the tree. Samuel Colt's, the Armory Band, assembled at the site and played funeral dirges for a while. The Hartford poet Lydia Sigourney composed typical Victorian mourning poetry about it. I remember reading in the newspapers, there were letters to the editors from Connecticut residents living outside of the state that were just totally dismayed by the fall of the Charter Oak. There was a local photographer, took pictures of it, took photographs of it, and he was publishing and selling photographs, small photographs of it for public consumption. There was a very famous lithograph done of the fallen oak that was a very popular item. The Hartford Courant wrote an article about the tree being blown over. The headline was, "The Charter Oak is prostrate," big black capital letters all across the top of the page. It was a major significant loss for Connecticut residents. Of course, there was still this possibility to commemorate the tree and maybe make a few bucks here and there. One cabinet maker in Hartford began fashioning little pieces of souvenir furniture, little pieces of bedsteads and dressers and goblets. There was even some jewelry made from pieces of it. Samuel Colt commissioned a cradle of charter oak wood for his newborn son. That's down at the Wadsworth Athenaeum. To this day, the president of the Senate of the state of Connecticut sits in a large, ornately carved chair made from the wood of the charter oak. Mark Twain visited Hartford in the 1870s, and he learned about or knew about the legend of the charter oak, and he was wined and dined throughout the city, and everybody that he met with had some piece of the charter oak in their house, and he suggested that perhaps the tree was big enough to have provided enough wood for a plank road from Hartford to Salt Lake City. I mean, there were a lot of legitimate things made from the charter oak, but also things said to be made from the wood of the charter oak that probably never were.
I think one of them that anybody can go see because it's a public institution is the Museum of Connecticut History. Do you not have the original charter framed in wood from that tree?
The frame itself is white oak, but to my knowledge and based on my research, it's not charter oak, but there's a crest on the top of the frame. It has the shield with the three grapevines from the Connecticut coat of arms, and there's some ribbons and clusters of acorns. That crest is made from the charter oak. The sculptor who did that his name was Entress. He also carved the block and gavel that's used in the Connecticut State Supreme Court, made from charter oak wood.
Is the charter in the Museum of Connecticut History the same charter that James Wadsworth supposedly spirited off with that evening?
We believe so. The charter that we have was originally in the Secretary of the State's office in the 1840s. It was on exhibit there. And it was transferred to the State Library, which used to be in what's now the Senate chamber in the state capitol, and it came here in 1910. There were copies of it. I know there's still one in the British Library, I believe, in London. It's hard to pin it down, but I'm comfortable saying that it is. Let's put it that way. Somebody suggested we should examine it for traces of white oak DNA along the edges or something. I don't think that's going to happen.
Maybe a final question on this. When you think of all the things in Connecticut, we're called the Nutmeg State, the land of steady habits, and the charter oak, it may be the most prominent way to know of Connecticut.
I think so. It was used, in addition to the furniture and things being made, it was used as a logo by a lot of companies in Connecticut. World War I soldiers in the 26th Division, the Yankee Division from Connecticut, had helmets with a little stencil outlining the charter oak on the front of their helmets for identification purposes. The American Legion in Connecticut has the charter oak on its patch. There was a charter oak lawnmower made in the 1850s at the Colt Armory of East Hartford. One of my favorite uses of the charter oak was in the 1950s. The Continental Distilling Company in Pennsylvania bottled a bourbon named Charter Oak, and it had a little image of the charter oak on the front label. It was known outside of the state, but primarily within Connecticut, although I think its use might have declined over the years. I don't think there's that many companies these days that are named Charter Oak anymore. There was a brewing company out in Bristol that had Charter Oak beer, Charter Oak lager, but it's still there. I mean, you can't avoid it. It pops up when you're exploring Connecticut history and you see it, and we get requests for information about it and images of it from time to time. It's still recognizable, and I think it's the foremost political legend of Connecticut and probably one of the most iconic images representing the state of Connecticut.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. There is one other famous oak tree from Connecticut history, and that was in the northern part of New Milford in Gaylordsville. Under that oak, George Washington himself held a meeting one day on his way to Hartford. Well, that tree also fell over after hundreds of years standing there, and a replacement tree and a plaque now mark that spot. I want to thank our guest for today's program, Dave Corrigan, the longtime and now retired curator of the Museum of Connecticut History. That museum, by the way, is across the street from the state capitol in Hartford. Put it on your bucket list. The answer to this week's trivia question, well, the question was, he showed a very special gold ring to the King of England, and Connecticut got something that many other colonial colonies did not. Who was he? The answer? John Winthrop Jr. In fact, he got the charter that we've been talking about in today's episode, the one hidden in the oak tree in Hartford. Next week on Amazing Tales CT, we welcome to the program Connecticut State Historian Emeritus Walt Woodward, who will tell us a story like very few can about one of the very first colonial governors of the Connecticut colony way back in the 1600s, John Winthrop Jr. Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.